Welcome back to Paranightmares, where the night whispers and we listen. If creepy tales and unsettling shadows are your kind of lullaby, you're in the right place. Before we descend into tonight's darkness, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're from and what time you're watching. After you finish the video, let us know which part made your skin crawl most. I'm watching, and I read everyone. The Desert Inn was a relic, a forgotten monument to a long-dead era of American road trips. It sat alone on a stretch of highway so desolate, the asphalt seemed to hum with a lonely, silent dread. Elias, an antique clock repairman whose van had suffered a terminal breakdown, found himself checking in for the night. The manager, a woman with a face like sun-baked leather and eyes that seemed to have seen every ghost from here to the horizon, gave him a key to room 7. "Don't mind the hum," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "Just the old fridge. And don't stay up late watching the window." She didn't elaborate, and Elias didn't ask. He was too tired. Room 7 was exactly as he'd expected, dingy, smelling of dust and stale cigarette smoke, with a single, buzzing fluorescent light fixture that cast a sickly yellow glow. The air conditioner rattled a rhythm that was more a death rattle than a cooling breeze. He tossed his bag on the bed, its springs groaning a complaint. The window, he noticed, looked out onto the barren, moonlit desert of vast, black canvas punctuated only by the occasional silhouette of a skeletal Joshua tree. He unpacked his tools, a comfortingly familiar set of brass and steel, planning to pass the night hours working on a delicate cuckoo clock he was transporting. It was a habit of his, a way to occupy his mind in places that felt too empty. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of a persistent, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floorboards. A hum that wasn't the fridge. It was a sound that felt more like a presence, a deep and ancient thrumming that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath the motel's foundation. Elias tried to ignore it, focusing on the intricate gears of the clock. He worked for an hour, then 2, the hum a constant, unwelcome companion. He glanced up, his gaze drawn to the window. Something was wrong with it. Not broken, not cracked, but observed. There was a faint reflection in the glass, a ghostly, half-formed shape that wasn't his own. It was tall and impossibly thin, a silhouette that seemed to waver and shift with the humming sound. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned his head slowly, but there was nothing behind him, only the empty, dust-filled room. He looked back at the window. The shape was still there, but now it was clearer. It was a figure, a sentinel of pure, black shadow. It stood motionless on the horizon, a monument to nothingness. It wasn't looking at him, not with eyes he could see, but he knew it was watching. He felt a profound sense of exposure, as if he were a single, vulnerable cell in a petri dish, being meticulously examined. Panic began to creep into his chest, a cold, sharp feeling. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of the light, a figment of his tired imagination. But the hum intensified, and the floorboards vibrated in time with a slow, deliberate pulse. The shadow in the window began to move. It didn't walk. It seemed to slide across the desert floor, a formless stain on the moonlit sand. It was coming closer, its progress unnaturally fast. Elias stumbled back, knocking over his box of tools. Gears and tiny springs scattered across the grimy carpet. He grabbed his phone, but there was no service. He was completely alone. He backed away from the window, his eyes fixed on the encroaching shadow. He saw that it wasn't just one figure, but a multitude, a legion of thin, silent shapes, all merging into one. Their collective form was what created the hum, a choir of silent, resonant dread. He remembered the manager's words, "Don't stay up late watching the window." He hadn't understood before. He hadn't realized that the window wasn't for looking out. It was for them to look in. He saw the first one reach the edge of the motel's property line, a boundary it couldn't cross. It stopped, its featureless face turning toward his room. The hum became a roar, a deafening sound inside his head. The shadow thing raised an arm, long and skeletal, and pressed a hand against the glass. It left a handprint, not of dirt or grime, but of pure, unlit darkness. The glass began to crack, the fractures spreading like a spiderweb from the point of contact. Elias screamed a raw, terrified sound. He ran to the door, fumbling with the deadbolt. The lock was old and rusted, the bolt refusing to slide. He pounded on the door, but the motel was silent. He was the only guest, he realized. The manager had left him as a meal, a sacrifice. The shadows were at every window now, a silent, ravenous army. They weren't just in his reflection. They were outside, pressing against the glass. The air grew cold, a freezing, unnatural chill. He could feel their gazes on him, an oppressive weight that stole his breath. With a final, desperate shove, he managed to unstick the deadbolt. He yanked the door open and sprinted down the empty corridor, the shadows in the windows watching his every move. He reached the lobby, the door unlocked. He burst into the night, the freezing wind stinging his face. The van was dead. The nearest town was miles away. He ran. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed. He didn't look back, but the hum was still with him, a deep, silent thrumming in his bones. He knew he was being watched, a tiny, terrified speck on a vast canvas of nothingness. And he knew that the shadows in the desert, the sentinels of the desert inn, were patient. They could wait. They had all the time in the world. And tonight, they had a new plaything. The Sunnyside Motel was a lie. There was no sun, and no side that could ever be called bright. It was perpetually shrouded in a clammy, gray fog that smelled of salt and mildew. Sam, a traveling salesman who'd taken a wrong turn, found himself pulling into its crumbling parking lot just as the last of the evening light died. The neon sign flickered, spelling out Sunnyside Motel in a sad, stuttering glow. He was given a key to room 12 by an elderly woman who seemed to be wearing every piece of clothing she owned, her face a map of weary wrinkles. She didn't speak, just pointed to the room and handed him a heavy iron key with a number tag, so worn it was almost illegible. As he walked down the corridor, the fog seemed to follow him, seeping under the door frames and clinging to the stained wallpaper. Room 12 was chilly, kind of cold that feels like a tomb. A single, naked light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak yellow circle on the threadbare rug. The bed was a creaky metal frame with a thin mattress, and the TV was a massive, ancient cathode ray tube set. He flicked it on, hoping for some sound to fill the oppressive silence, but all he got was a loud blast of static. He immediately turned it off. He was just beginning to settle in when he heard a noise from the adjacent room, room 11. It was a scratching sound, rhythmic and persistent, like fingernails dragging across a blackboard. Sam put his ear to the wall, a faint thrumming pulsing through the plaster. He couldn't make out what it was, but the sound was unnerving. He tried knocking on the wall, but the scratching didn't stop. It just continued, a methodical, maddening rhythm. After a few minutes, he gave up and decided to get some sleep. The bed was uncomfortable, and the scratching from next door was a constant irritant. But eventually, the exhaustion of the road won out, and he drifted into a restless slumber. He dreamed of scratching, of a woman with long, skeletal fingers clawing at a door that wouldn't open. He woke with a gasp, the dream still fresh and terrifying. The scratching had stopped. Relieved, Sam sat up, listening to the silence. It was even more unnerving than the noise. He glanced at his phone. It was 3 a.m. He got up to get a glass of water, and as he passed the bathroom, he heard a new noise. It was a faint, muffled sob. It came from the pipes, a sorrowful, watery lament that seemed to emanate from the very walls. He ignored it, telling himself it was just the old pipes, and went back to bed. The next morning, the fog was still there, thicker than ever. As he was checking out, he asked the old woman about the noise. The scratching from room 11, he said. Who's in there? The woman's face, already a study in sorrow, seemed to fall even further. Room 11 is empty, sir. It's been empty for a long time. Sam's blood ran cold. Then what was the scratching? The woman looked at him, her eyes old and full of a profound sadness. It's the guest. the one who never left. Sam didn't understand, and the woman offered no further explanation. He paid his bill, his hands trembling, and got in his car. The fog seemed to swallow his headlights, and the Sunnyside Motel vanished in his rearview mirror as if it had never existed. He drove for hours, the image of the old woman's face and the sound of the scratching seared into his mind. He drove to the next town, a small, bustling place full of bright lights and cheerful people. He checked into a brand new chain hotel, a place of clean sheets and modern amenities. As he was unpacking, he heard a faint scratching sound from the wall between his room and the next. He froze, his heart pounding. He put his ear to the wall, the rhythmic sound pulsing against his cheek. It was unmistakable. It was the same sound he'd heard at the Sunnyside. He ran to the front desk, but the clerk just smiled and said, "Sir, you're the only guest on this floor. It's a very quiet night." Sam went back to his room, his mind racing. He looked around, a growing sense of dread washing over him. He was trapped. The guest from room 11 had followed him. The scratching continued, now joined by a low, muffled sob from the bathroom. He realized the scratching wasn't a person trying to get out. It was a person trying to get in. And the sobs were his. They were a reflection of his own fear, a prelude to his own fate. He was the next perpetual guest, destined to wander the corridors of lonely motels, forever scratching at the walls of the next temporary resident, a ghostly harbinger of the dread that would one day consume them. He was not a guest who had checked in, but a ghost who had checked out, leaving a piece of himself behind. The Golden Crest Motel was an island of orange light in a sea of rural darkness. Its neon sign, a faded beacon from the 1970s, buzzed with a sound that was more of a wheeze than a hum. For David, a photographer on a cross-country assignment, it was a welcome sight after a long day of shooting empty landscapes. The manager, a man with a tired mustache and an even more tired gaze, handed him the key to room 9. "The TV's a bit fuzzy," he said, "but the mirror's fine. It's an old one. Came with the place." Room 9 was small and tidy, a sterile box of white walls and brown carpet. The bed was neatly made, and a single, heavy wooden nightstand stood by the window. Above the nightstand hung the mirror. It was a large, ornate thing, with a tarnished gold frame carved with intricate, swirling patterns. The glass was cloudy in places, giving the reflections a soft, ethereal quality. David set his camera back down, took a moment to stretch, and then caught his own tired reflection in the mirror. He looked pale, lines of fatigue etched around his eyes. He thought for a moment about how the mirror seemed to be judging him. He was used to staying in places like this, places that felt more like time capsules than accommodations. They all had their quirks. This motel's was the mirror. Later that night, as he was editing photos on his laptop, he glanced up at the mirror. He saw his own reflection, but something was different. The man in the mirror was staring not at the screen, but directly at him. A slow, unsettling grin spread across its face, a grin that wasn't on David's own. David's heart jumped. He looked away, shaking his head. He was just tired, he told himself. His eyes were playing tricks on him. He took a deep breath and looked back. His reflection was now normal again. A man hunched over a laptop, a look of tired concentration on his face. He dismissed it as a figment of his overactive imagination, a byproduct of too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But the next time he looked, the reflection was subtly different. The man in the mirror was wearing a suit, a vintage 1940s pinstripe suit, complete with a fedora. His face was a little thinner, his eyes a little darker. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, and he raised it to David in a silent toast. David dropped his laptop, the clatter echoing in the silent room. He scrambled back from the bed, his mind reeling. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was real. He watched in horror as the man in the mirror took a sip from his glass, a soundless motion. The man's eyes, a piercing blue, stared right through him, a look of profound amusement on his face. David looked at his own clothes, the worn jeans and t-shirt he had been wearing all day. He looked at the room, the sterile white walls and brown carpet. Then he looked at the mirror. The man was still there, the pinstripe suit, the fedora. But now, the room around him was different. The walls were a dark mahogany, the carpet a deep crimson. The nightstand was gone, replaced by a heavy, wooden desk. A woman in a shimmering red dress was dancing with a phantom man in the background. The man in the mirror was no longer a reflection. He was a window into another time, another version of this very same room. He realized the mirror wasn't reflecting his reality. It was reflecting its own. It was a doorway to a different plane of existence, a doorway that was slowly opening. He saw the man in the mirror begin to smile again, this time a slow, predatory smile. He put down his glass and walked toward the glass, his hand outstretched. He was going to touch it. David, paralyzed by fear, could only watch as the man's hand pressed against the glass. He heard a faint tapping sound, a sound that was coming from inside the mirror. The glass, which had been cloudy and ethereal, was now as clear as a bell. The man's eyes, a piercing blue, were now fixed on David. He was beckoning him to come closer. David stumbled backward, a guttural scream rising in his throat. He ran to the door, his hands fumbling with the lock. The lock was an old, rusted thing, and the bolt refused to slide. He pounded on the door, but the motel was silent. He was the only guest on this side of the building. He remembered. He was completely alone. He glanced back at the mirror. The man was gone, but his face, his own face, was now in the mirror. It was smiling a slow, terrifying smile. A smile that wasn't on his own face. He saw his own eyes, a terrified reflection, but his mouth was twisted in a sinister grin. He heard a whisper, a disembodied voice that seemed to come from the mirror itself. "Join us," it said. "We have so much to show you." He felt a hand on his shoulder, a cold, skeletal grip. He turned around, but there was nothing there. He looked back at the mirror. His reflection was now wearing the pinstripe suit, a fedora tilted over its eyes. He was no longer a reflection. He was a part of the mirror's world. And the real David, the terrified man in the brown carpeted room, was now the reflection. He was trapped, forever. The Starlight Motel was a misnomer. There were no stars, just a heavy, bruised sky that seemed to press down on the roof. Liam, an insomniac truck driver, pulled into the desolate lot, the only vehicle for miles. The manager, a gaunt man with a perpetual twitch in his eye, didn't bother to look at him. He just slid a key across the counter, its tag worn to a smooth, featureless nub. "Room 4, he grunted. "Don't touch the TV. It's got a temper." Liam took the key and trudged to room 4. It was cold, kind of cold that feels like a physical weight on your chest. The air smelled of ozone and something else, something metallic and sharp, like a freshly severed wire. The bed was a lumpy mess, and a single, ancient television sat on a rickety stand in the corner. Its screen was a blank, dark rectangle. Liam, desperate for some distraction from his restless mind, decided to ignore the manager's warning. He plugged the TV in and turned it on. The screen flickered to life with a blast of violent static, a chaotic, snowy storm of white and black. The sound was a loud, high-pitched hiss, a sound that seemed to bore into his skull. He tried to change the channel, but the remote was dead. He tried to turn the volume down, but the knob was broken. The static was constant, deafening assault on his senses. He was about to unplug it when he saw something in the static. A face. It was a fleeting image, a momentary flicker of a woman's face, pale and distorted, her eyes wide with terror. Then it was gone, swallowed by the snowy chaos. Liam froze, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He shook his head, telling himself it was just his sleep-deprived mind playing tricks on him. But the image was seared into his brain. He couldn't shake it. He sat on the bed, his gaze fixed on the screen. He watched for another few minutes, and then he saw it again. This time it was a man's face, his mouth open in a silent scream. And then a little girl, her face contorted in a mask of pure terror. They weren't just faces, they were moments, fragments of horror captured in the perpetual storm of static. Liam realized the static wasn't random. It was a collage of terror, a perpetual replay of all the horror that had ever happened in this room. The faces were the guests who had stayed here, the victims of some unseen force, and the static. The static was the sound of their dying screams, their terrified breaths, their frantic heartbeats. The ozone smell was the lingering scent of their electrocuted bodies. He stumbled back from the bed, his mind reeling. He had to get out of here. He had to leave this room, this motel, this desolate place. But as he turned to the door, he heard a new sound. It was the sound of the TV, but it was coming from inside his head. He could hear the hiss of the static, the frantic, terrified screams of the faces in the screen. He could hear them pleading, begging him to help them, to save them. He could feel their fear, a cold, sharp feeling that seemed to pierce his soul. He looked at the TV screen. The faces were still there, but now they were clearer. They were no longer just images. They were real. He could see the terror in their eyes, the desperation in their faces. They were looking at him, not just through the screen, but through his eyes, his mind. They were trying to tell him something. They were trying to warn him. He looked at his reflection in the dark screen, his own face pale and terrified. He saw a flicker of movement behind him, a shadowy figure in the corner of the room. He turned, but there was nothing there. He looked back at the screen. The man's face was gone. The woman's face was gone. The little girl's face was gone. All that was left was his own reflection, his face a mask of terror. And then a new face appeared in the static, a face he had seen before, the gaunt, twitching face of the manager. His mouth was open in a silent, predatory grin. Liam realized the manager wasn't just a manager. He was a collector of terror, of screams, of souls. He was the one who had created this static, this eternal prison of fear. And now, he had a new addition to his collection. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his head, a blinding flash of light. He fell to the floor, his body convulsing. He could hear the static, the screams, the pleas, but they were no longer coming from the TV. They were coming from his own mouth. He was one of them now, a face in the static, a prisoner in the Starlight Motel. He was the perpetual guest, a victim of the static room, destined to relive his final moments of terror for eternity. The Crestwood Inn was a forgotten ghost on a winding country road, its name a faded promise of comfort. Jack, a journalist researching a series of mysterious disappearances in the area, checked in for the night. The manager, a cheerful woman with a surprisingly bright smile, handed him a key to room 5. "Don't mind the creaks," she said. "The old place is just settling in, and the walls are a bit thin, so you might hear the neighbors." Room 5 was cozy, a small, wood-paneled room with a single bed and a small desk. Jack set his laptop on the desk, intending to transcribe some interviews. He was a man of logic and reason, a skeptic who believed in facts and evidence, not ghost stories. He was here to find a rational explanation for the disappearances, not to become a part of them. As he was working, he heard a sound. It was a faint, scraping sound coming from inside the walls. He dismissed it as the sound of an old building settling, or maybe a mouse. But the sound continued, and it wasn't a mouse. It was a rhythmic, scraping noise, like something was dragging its body along the plaster. It was coming from the wall behind his bed. Jack ignored it, focusing on his work, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer a scraping. It was a rhythmic, heavy dragging, and it was moving. It was moving up the wall, toward the ceiling, then across the ceiling, then down the wall on the other side of the room. It was circling him, a slow, methodical orbit. He stopped typing, his hands hovering over the keyboard. He listened to the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. He was alone in the room, but he wasn't alone in the building. There was something else here, something living inside the walls. He was a skeptic, but he couldn't deny what he was hearing. He was not a fool. He got up and put his ear to the wall. He could hear a faint scratching sound, a sound of something heavy and wet. He could hear a slow, deliberate breathing, a sound that was not human. He could hear a faint, gurgling sound, as if something was swallowing something it should not. He ran to the door, fumbling with the lock. but the door was old and rusted, and the bolt refused to slide. He was trapped. He was a journalist who had come here to find a story, and now he was a part of it. He was a victim. The sound in the walls grew louder. It was no longer a scraping. It was a tearing. The plaster on the wall behind his bed began to crack, a long, jagged fracture spreading across the surface. He backed away, his eyes wide with horror. He could see a dark, sticky substance seeping through the crack, a thick, black fluid that smelled of decay and rot. He heard a low, guttural growl, a sound that was not human. He saw a hand, a long, skeletal hand with sharp, black claws, emerge from the crack. It was reaching for him, its fingers writhing like a nest of snakes. He screamed a raw, terrified sound. He scrambled back, knocking over his desk. He could hear the manager's cheerful voice in his head. "Don't mind the creaks. The old place is just settling in, and the walls are a bit thin, so you might hear the neighbors." He looked at the wall, at the long, skeletal hand reaching for him. He realized the manager hadn't meant human neighbors. The neighbors weren't people. They were the things that lived in the walls, the things that were drawn to the inn, the things that were hungry, and he was their dinner. He was the next disappearance, a footnote in a long, dark story. He saw the thing in the walls pull itself out of the crack, its body a mass of writhing, black flesh and sharp, bony limbs. It was a thing of nightmares, a monster that defied all logic and reason. It was here to take him, to consume him, to add him to its collection of lost souls. He could hear the screams of its past victims in his head, a chorus of terror and despair. He was a journalist who had come here to find a rational explanation for the disappearances, and now he was a part of the story. He was a victim, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his story would be a short one. His final thoughts were of the woman with the cheerful smile, the woman who had handed him the key, the woman who had left him as a meal, and he knew that he would never see the light of day again. He was trapped, a final meal for the thing in the walls. The high desert motel was an anomaly, a splash of modernism in a sea of dusty, old-school motels. Its sign was a sleek, digital display, its parking lot a pristine expanse of asphalt, but something about it felt off. It felt too clean, too perfect, as if it were a stage set for a play that hadn't yet begun. Sarah, a travel writer, checked in for the night, her goal to write a piece on the contrast between old and new motels. The manager, a young man with a polite but vacant smile, handed her a key. "Room 0, he said. "It's our newest room. It's got all the latest tech. Just don't try to leave after midnight. The security system locks everything down." Sarah didn't think much of the warning. She'd been in high-tech motels before. She walked down the pristine corridor, its walls a sleek, metallic gray. The doors were all a uniform shade of white, with small, digital numbers on them. But room 0 had no number. It was a blank, white door, the only one without a number. She unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was a futuristic pod of clean lines and smooth surfaces. The bed was a floating platform, and the walls were covered in a single, seamless LED screen that displayed a serene, digital forest. The air smelled of fresh ozone and something else, something metallic and sharp, like a freshly severed wire. She set her luggage down and began to explore the room. The bathroom was a sleek, minimalist affair, with a shower that seemed to appear out of thin air. The TV was a massive, curved screen that spanned the entire wall. But the most unsettling thing was the lack of a window. The room was a hermetically sealed box, a sterile, man-made environment. As she was unpacking, she noticed a small, digital display on the wall. It showed a single, blinking number, 0. She pressed it, and the display changed to a series of numbers, a clock that was counting down. It read, 12 hours. It was a countdown to midnight. Sarah's heart began to pound. She realized the manager's warning wasn't a joke. The security system was real. She was locked in. She tried to open the door, but the lock was a digital keypad that required a code. She didn't have one. She was trapped. She ran to the TV, a massive, curved screen that spanned the entire wall. She tried to turn it off, but the remote was dead. She tried to change the channel, but the screen was a blank, black rectangle. She was a captive audience to the digital forest on the walls, a silent, surreal witness to her own fate. As the clock ticked down, the digital forest on the walls began to change. The trees, which had been a serene, digital green, began to twist and contort, their branches turning into grasping, skeletal fingers. The ground, which had been a lush, digital carpet, began to writhe and squirm, as if something was moving beneath its surface. The sky, which had been a serene, digital blue, turned a bruised, sickly purple. She heard a sound, a faint, disembodied whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You are not alone," it said. "You are our newest guest." Sarah screamed a raw, terrified sound. She scrambled back, her hands covering her ears. She was a travel writer who had come here to find story, and now she was a part of it. She was a victim. The clock ticked down to midnight, and the room went dark. The digital forest on the walls vanished, replaced by a black, featureless void. She was in a perfect, absolute darkness. She could hear the sound of her own frantic breathing, the sound of her heart pounding against her ribs, and she could hear another sound, a sound that was not human. It was a faint, slithering sound, a sound of something moving in the dark. She felt a hand on her shoulder, a cold, skeletal grip. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. She was no longer in the room with no number. She was in a place with no number, no name, no time. She was in a perfect, absolute darkness, and she was not alone. The Nightfall Motel was a roadside horror show, a collection of dilapidated cabins with peeling paint and sagging roofs. It was the only place for Miles, and for Maria, a hitchhiker who had been dropped off in the middle of nowhere. It was her only option. The manager, a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to smile, handed her a key to cabin 13. "Just don't listen to the vents," he said. "They're old. They talk to themselves." Cabin 13 was a tiny, cramped space with a bed, a dresser, and a small, rusted air conditioner unit. The air smelled of must and damp earth. A single, dusty ceiling fan whirred a slow, tired rhythm. Maria set her backpack on the bed and began to unpack. She was a woman of logic and reason, a survivor who had seen a lot of strange things in her life. She wasn't afraid of a little old motel. As she was unpacking, she heard a sound. It was a faint, whispering sound, a sound that seemed to be coming from the air vents. She put her ear to the vent, a small, metal grate on the wall. She could hear a faint, distorted voice, a soft, sibilant sound that was just on the edge of her comprehension. It wasn't a person. It was a whisper. She dismissed it as the sound of the wind or the old air conditioner. But the whisper continued, and it wasn't the wind. It was a language, a series of words that she couldn't understand, but that she felt in her bones. It was a language of sorrow, of grief, of profound despair. It was the sound of a woman crying. Maria's heart began to pound. She was alone in the cabin, but she wasn't alone. There was something else here, something trapped in the vents. She was a survivor, but she wasn't immune to fear. She had to get out of here. She ran to the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. But the lock was old and rusted, and the bolt refused to slide. She was trapped. She was a hitchhiker who had come here to find a place to rest, and now she was a part of the story. She was a victim. The whisper in the vents grew louder. It was no longer a soft, sibilant sound. It was a chorus of voices, a cacophony of whispers and sobs and pleas. She could hear the voices of men, women, and children, all crying out in pain and terror. They were the guests who had stayed in this cabin, the victims of some unseen force. And the vents were the sound of their dying screams, their terrified breaths, their frantic heartbeats. She looked at the air conditioner unit, its rusted metal a grotesque monument to a long-dead past. She realized the manager hadn't meant the vents were just old. They were a listening device, a conduit for the suffering of all who had ever stayed in this cabin. And she was the newest addition to their chorus. The whispers in the vents grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer just a sound. They were words. They were her name. Maria, they whispered. Maria, join us. We're so lonely. She screamed a raw, terrified sound. She scrambled back, her hands covering her ears. She was a survivor, but she wasn't immune to terror. She had to get out of here. She ran to the window, a small, grimy rectangle of glass. She tried to open it, but the frame was swollen and the glass was stuck. She was a prisoner in her own cabin, a captive audience to the chorus of whispers. She looked at the bed, its sheets a tangled mess. She saw a faint, shadowy figure standing by the dresser, a woman in a long white dress. She was the woman whose voice she had heard in the vents, the woman who had been crying. She was beckoning her to come closer. Maria felt a cold hand on her shoulder, a skeletal grip. She turned, but there was nothing there. She looked back at the woman in the white dress. She was no longer a shadowy figure. She was real. Her eyes were empty sockets, her mouth a black hole. She was a ghost, a perpetual resident of the Nightfall Motel. Maria screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the chorus of whispers. She was one of them now, a voice in the vents, a prisoner in cabin 13. She was the newest member of the chorus, destined to whisper her own story of terror for all eternity. The Last Resort was a name that promised a final, desperate haven, but to Ethan, a painter traveling cross-country in search of inspiration, it felt more like a threat than a promise. The motel was a bizarre architectural mess, a jumble of mismatched building styles that seemed to have been slapped together in a fit of architectural insanity. The manager, a man with a tired mustache and an even more tired gaze, handed him a key to room 14. "Don't mind the strange angles," he said. "The old place is just unique." Room 14 was a chaotic, asymmetrical space. The walls were at strange angles, the floor sloped down toward the window, and the ceiling was a series of bizarre, interlocking planes. It was a nightmare of a room for an artist who valued clean lines and symmetry. But Ethan was exhausted. He set his bags down, intending to sleep and deal with the room's peculiarities in the morning. As he was getting ready for bed, he noticed a new angle in the room. A corner that had been a simple, right-angled intersection was now a sharp, acute angle. The wall, which had been a flat, featureless surface, now had a subtle curve to it. It was as if the room itself was alive, a living, breathing organism that was constantly shifting and changing. Ethan, a man of logic and reason, tried to find a rational explanation. He told himself it was just his tired eyes playing tricks on him. He took a deep breath and looked again. The corner was still an acute angle, and the wall still had a subtle curve. He felt a profound sense of unease. He got out of bed and ran his hand along the wall. The plaster was cold and slick, and he could feel a faint vibration, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to be coming from inside the wall. He was a man of logic and reason, but he couldn't deny what he was feeling. He was not a fool. He ran to the door, his hands fumbling with the lock. But the door was an old, rusted thing, and the bolt refused to slide. He was trapped. He was a painter who had come here to find inspiration, and now he was a part of the canvas. He was a victim. The walls began to shift again, their angles becoming more pronounced, their curves more grotesque. The room was no longer a room, it was a cage. The ceiling, a series of interlocking planes, began to move, its edges grinding against each other with a sound like grinding teeth. The floor, which had been a subtle slope, was now a steep, impossible hill that he couldn't climb. He heard a low, guttural growl, a sound that was not human. It was a sound that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, a sound of profound hunger. He was a man of logic and reason, but he couldn't deny what he was hearing. He was not a fool. He looked at the window, a small, grimy rectangle of glass. He tried to open it, but the frame was swollen and the glass was stuck. He was a prisoner in his own room, a captive audience to the shifting, grotesque spectacle. He looked at the bed, its sheets a tangled mess. He saw a faint, shadowy figure standing by the dresser, a man with a tired mustache and an even more tired gaze. It was the manager, He was beckoning him to come closer. Ethan felt a cold hand on his shoulder, a skeletal grip. He turned, but there was nothing there. He looked back at the manager. He was no longer a shadowy figure. He was real. His eyes were empty sockets, his mouth a black hole. He was a ghost, a perpetual resident of the last resort. The walls began to shift again, their angles becoming more pronounced, their curves more grotesque. The room was a labyrinth of impossible geometry, a trap from which there was no escape. The manager, a grotesque, distorted figure, was now standing in the middle of the room, his body a mass of strange angles and impossible curves. He was a part of the room, a living, breathing embodiment of its insanity. Ethan screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the grinding of the walls. He was one of them now, a distorted figure in a room of impossible geometry. He was a victim of the shifting walls, destined to spend eternity as a part of the last resort's grotesque, ever-changing canvas. The Whispering Pines Motel was a quaint, idyllic place. A collection of charming, A-frame cabins nestled among a grove of tall, whispering pine trees. It was the kind of place that promised rest and tranquility, a perfect getaway from the chaos of the city. For Lisa, a novelist suffering from a bad case of writer's block, it was a beacon of hope. The manager, a kind-faced woman with a warm smile, handed her a key to cabin 10. "You'll love it here," she said. "It's so peaceful. You can hear the pines whispering in the wind." Cabin 10 was a small, cozy space with a bed, a desk, and a large window that looked out onto the pine trees. The air smelled of fresh pine and clean laundry. A single, dusty ceiling fan whirred a slow, tired rhythm. Lisa set her laptop on the desk, intending to spend the next few days writing the next great American novel. She was a novelist, a woman of imagination and creativity, a believer in the power of a good story. As she was working, she heard a sound. It was a laugh, a soft, gentle, almost musical laugh, coming from outside her window. She looked out, but there was no one there. The pines were swaying in the wind, their branches whispering a quiet, sibilant song. She dismissed it as the sound of the wind or the trees, but the laugh continued, and it wasn't the wind. It was a child's laugh, a clear, sweet, and utterly innocent sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Lisa's heart began to pound. She was alone in the cabin, but she wasn't alone in the motel. There were other guests, she knew. A family, perhaps, with a child. But the laughter was too close. It was coming from right outside her window, a disembodied, ghostly sound that seemed to have no source. She ran to the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. But the door was old and rusted, and the bolt refused to slide. She was trapped. She was a novelist who had come here to find a story, and now she was a part of it. She was a victim. The laughter in pines grew louder. It was no longer a single child's laugh. It was a chorus of laughs, a cacophony of giggles and guffaws and chortles. She could hear the laughs of men, women, and children, all laughing in a strange, disembodied chorus that seemed to have no end. They were the guests who had stayed in this cabin, the victims of some unseen force, and the pines were the sound of their eternal, horrifying laughter. She looked at the window, a small, grimy rectangle of glass. She tried to open it, but the frame was swollen and the glass was stuck. She was a prisoner in her own cabin, a captive audience to the chorus of laughter. She looked at the bed, its sheets a tangled mess. She saw a faint, shadowy figure standing by the dresser, a woman in a long, white dress. She was the woman whose voice she had heard in the laughter, the woman who had been laughing. She was beckoning her to come closer. Lisa felt a cold hand on her shoulder, a skeletal grip. She turned, but there was nothing there. She looked back at the woman in the white dress. She was no longer a shadowy figure. She was real. Her eyes were empty sockets, her mouth a black hole. She was a ghost, a perpetual resident of the Whispering Pines Motel. The laughter in the pines grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a sound. It was a feeling. It was a feeling of profound, soul-crushing despair. She was one of them now, a voice in the laughter, a prisoner in cabin 10. She was the newest member of the chorus, destined to laugh her own story of terror for all eternity. The Lone Star Motel was a dusty, forgotten relic on a long, straight road in the middle of nowhere. Its neon sign, a faded, flickering star, was the only source of light for miles. For Alex, a software engineer whose car had broken down, it was a final, desperate refuge. The manager, a man with a tired mustache and an even more tired gaze, handed him a key to room 15. "It's got a nice view of the desert," he said. "Just don't try to leave after midnight. The security system locks everything down." Room 15 was a sterile, white box of a room. The bed was neatly made, and a single, heavy wooden nightstand stood by the window. Alex set his laptop on the desk, intending to pass the night hours working on a coding project. He was a man of logic and reason, a skeptic who believed in facts and evidence, not ghost stories. He was here to get some sleep and get on the road in the morning. He was just about to settle in when he noticed something strange about the room. There were no doors. The room had a bed, a nightstand, and a window, but there was no door. The wall where the door should have been was a smooth, seamless expanse of white plaster. He ran his hand along the wall, but there was no seam, no handle, no lock. He was trapped. Alex's heart began to pound. He was a software engineer who had come here to find a place to rest, and now he was a part of the story. He was a victim. He ran to the window, a small, grimy rectangle of glass. He tried to open it, but the frame was swollen and the glass was stuck. He was a prisoner in his own room, a captive audience to the shifting, grotesque spectacle. The walls began to close in, their angles becoming more pronounced, their curves more grotesque. The room was no longer a room. It was a cage. The ceiling, a series of interlocking planes, began to move, its edges grinding against each other with a sound like grinding teeth. The floor, which had been a subtle slope, was now a steep, impossible hill that he couldn't climb. He heard a low, guttural growl, a sound that was not human. It was a sound that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, a sound of profound hunger. He was a man of logic and reason, but he couldn't deny what he was hearing. He was not a fool. He looked at the bed, its sheets a tangled mess. He saw a faint, shadowy figure standing by the dresser, a man with a tired mustache and an even more tired gaze. It was the manager. He was beckoning him to come closer. Alex felt a cold hand on his shoulder, a skeletal grip. He turned, but there was nothing there. He looked back at the manager. He was no longer a shadowy figure. He was real. His eyes were empty sockets, his mouth a black hole. He was a ghost, a perpetual resident of the Lone Star Motel. The walls began to close in again, their angles becoming more pronounced, their curves more grotesque. The room was a labyrinth of impossible geometry, a trap from which there was no escape. The manager, grotesque, distorted figure, was now standing in the middle of the room, his body a mass of strange angles and impossible curves. He was a part of the room, a living, breathing embodiment of its insanity. Alex screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the grinding of the walls. He was one of them now, a distorted figure in a room of impossible geometry. He was a victim of the room with no doors, destined to spend eternity as a part of the Lone Star Motel's grotesque, ever-changing canvas.